Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time. Actually, this is a very special Halloween edition. And we're going to try to make sure that it's not like the ill-fated late 70s Star Wars Christmas special, because we all know how that turned out, although it is still gold on YouTube. But I'm joined today by Eric Bond, who is the brains behind the thought for this episode. So, Eric, I'm going to let you say, in Chris Coppola words, hi to the good folks. Well, you don't have to say that because that's his line and you'd be stealing it, but say hello and then get us rolling here. We'll jump right into it.
Well, hello, Don, and hello to all the good folks out there. So this has been an idea that's been boiling over in my brain for ever since I started recording with y'all. And I'm really excited to finally bring this to the masses with you today.
Cool.
Yeah. So, Don, do you have any Halloween traditions that you love?
Halloween is actually not my absolute favorite holiday. So I don't have a lot of deep traditions. We've normally done fall festivals or fall events, either at our church or in the community, things like that. When I was a kid, a couple of friends of mine that I grew up with that lived very near to me, we would all go trick-or-treating together, the three or four of us. So that was when I was a kid, that was the understood norm. But I don't really have anything that I would call a deep, long-standing tradition.
Mine is just getting a sugar rush and then falling asleep, typically. So
that's as good as any tradition I can think of right then and there.
Absolutely. But I thought maybe since I started working with y'all, I could do something a little bit more speculative. Like, we typically try to stay pretty straight edge when it comes to, like, on the sliding scale of soft alternate history to hard alternate history.
Yeah, for just so our listeners understand, often in the pre-podcast and planning discussions that we have, we will use the word viable to describe our fork, to sort of, keep it within the realm of, we have a lot of room to roam, obviously, with alternate history, but we try to keep it, as you say, more towards the factual side of something that's fiction, if that makes any sense whatsoever.
Yes. So today we're just going to throw all of that out the window and have some fun. So the setting is Mount Vernon. We're going to be covering the time period of December 12th through December 14th of 1799. And I want to ask you a quick question, Don. How did George Washington die?
I don't think I know the answer to that question. I've been to Mount Vernon multiple times as a visitor, and I've seen the bedroom in which he did die, but the actual cause of death, if I had to go on Jeopardy and put that in the form of a question, I don't think I could nail it.
That is A-okay. We're about to find out. So we are starting on December 12th of 1799. George Washington rides through Mount Vernon to examine his 5 farms and distilleries. Typically, this is a process that would take roughly 6 hours for him to accomplish. Then Washington would go home and expect to find a dozen or more strangers with letters of introduction, desperate to eat with the former president. In fact, in 1798, the number of strangers who would show up over the course of a year by Mount Vernon's estimates was 677 people.
Wow.
George Washington would make a note in his diary if nobody showed up.
That was the unusual event, if no one was at the door, right?
Exactly. In a way, Washington had been used to such experiences in the White House. You could schedule a meeting, find the general posed by the fireplace with a sword, exchange a few polite words, and then you would let the next gawker in. It was very much more of a zoo show than really meeting the president. It's like, oh, a president. We've never seen one before. I wonder, oh, he doesn't like to be touched. Let's move on. Let the next family in. Oh, they brought a baby. guess they have to take them out somewhere. But December 12th, though, was a day marked with both snow, frozen rain, and hail, which considerably slowed Washington's progress through his various properties. Washington returned for dinner sopping wet in his clothes and refused to change for the sake of making his guests wait even longer. He did not want to keep them waiting. He was a gentleman, first and foremost. So they have dinner. They are attended by slaves. It's a lovely time for all of them, I'm sure. I don't really know. Yes, Saru, I'm aware I was making a poor taste joke. That's my cat. So that takes us then to December 13th. Washington wakes up. He reports that he's feeling a little weary to his secretary, Tobias Lear, who is also a colonel. Very strange to have a colonel also be your secretary, but these were the olden times. But anyway, Washington felt well enough to go out and order a clearing of trees from his property. He was later that evening too hoarse to read the paper aloud to Martha Washington, which apparently was a tradition they had. I don't know if he was just keeping a tight lid on her literacy, but to prevent her from getting ideas like Abigail Adams was.
Or if he was exercising some form of editorial control, right?
He's like, yes, it says here George Washington, tops. He would have had something more akin to a British Virginian accent, which I don't even want to imagine. That's the real horror story we won't go into tonight.
There you go.
So this takes us to December 14th. Washington summons his personal physician, Dr. James Craik. He had been Washington's physician for 40 years at that point. And he wanted to tell Craik that he had a sore throat and difficulty breathing. Now, like many a sick husband, Washington decided to ignore Martha's sound medical advice and do something stupid against his wife's wishes, which takes us to our pop quiz. You thought you were safe, Don, but I put a pop quiz in this. So, what was the stupid thing George Washington wanted to do? Again, this is for a sore throat. A, get flogged 10 times with a switch to sweat it out. B, bloodletting via cutting a vein to either his elbow or his knee. C, having his dentures removed and gargling with lamb's blood. D, swim the Potomac with John Quincy Adams.
I'm going to eliminate D because it seems unlikely for a number of reasons. I thought we were going to get to an E, all of the above potentially. So, but apparently we didn't get that as a choice. Strangely enough, I'm going to go with the gargling of lamb's blood.
Ooh, unfortunately, that is incorrect. The answer was B, bloodletting, by cutting a vein in his elbow or knee.
Well, bloodletting would have been my logical first choice, but this was one of those things where it's like, don't go with the obvious. It's probably not the obvious.
I understand entirely. And funny enough, Grace answered that same thing. I tested all of the pop questions out on her. So, per the advice of signer of the Declaration of Independence and a close friend of Washington, Dr. Benjamin Rush, Washington was a longtime advocate of bloodletting to balance the 4 humors of the human body, these being, bile, blood, phlegm, and mucus, if I'm remembering correctly from my studies of Greek medicine. So, despite Martha Washington's misgivings over their efficacy, George at the very least relented to her request that they get a few other doctors be called in for alternate solutions. So, to this end, they got doctors Gustavus Richard Brown, Elisha Cullen Dick, and William Thornton. William Thornton wouldn't arrive until George Washington had died already, which may be important later.
Yeah.
For now, though, 3 doctors were on the scene, and like too many cooks in the kitchen, Washington's egg was cracked and too many metaphors were killed in that sentence alone. Probably to Martha's annoyance, even more ineffective treatments were attempted to cure, again, a sore throat and shortness of breath. Pop quiz. What other treatments were used? This one you can do all that apply.
Okay.
A, blister George Washington's throat with a toxic tonic called Spanish fly. B, pour molasses, butter, and vinegar down his throat. C, induce vomiting with mercury-infused chloride. D, enemas. E, even more bloodletting.
I'm going to go everything except to the next to the last. I'm going to guess if enemas were in the solution, they were at least in the wrong part of the body.
Nope, it was also enemas as well. Everything above.
Wow.
Yeah, they tried all of the above. Again, this was for a sore throat. Now, in an age where the common life expectancy in America was 50, George Washington had been a surprisingly energetic 67-year-old. He had promised Martha to at least try to make it to 1800. He would not.
He was close, but
Yeah.
mostly going close.
Yeah, probably from the exhaustive malpractice being visited upon him. After the fourth bloodletting, which within 12 hours, George Washington is theorized to have lost about 2.365 liters of blood, which roughly equates to 40% of his total blood supply. This would also work out to about 79.97 fluid ounces, filling a total of 4 3/4 standard Arrowhead water bottles.
Wow.
Yeah. So if anybody's drinking an Arrowhead water bottle, now you can think about that. Now, knowing or maybe praying the end was near at this point, Washington turned to Dr. Craik and said, "Doctor, I die hard, but I am not afraid to go. I believed from my first attack that I should not survive it. My breath cannot last long." I don't know why he was played by Katharine Hepburn, but that's the choice I made. He still had breath enough for a few hours more, though, and got about settling his books with Tobias Lear. George Washington arranged for the 123 humans he personally owned as slaves to be freed, though this would not occur until a year after his death in our timeline. To give you an idea, they had about 300 slaves, half of whom were George Washington's personally. He got his first slave at the age of 10, which is a very weird family tradition I don't even want to spend that much time contemplating. And the rest came from Martha and her first husband, Parcustus. Now, he did have a very particular wish for his corpse. So, what did Washington want for his corpse after death? A, that he never be revived via the use of magic or technology. B, that before he be laid in state, his dentures be cleaned out and set with the teeth of one of his younger slaves, Cadmus Davis, who is the half-brother of Ona Oni Judge. C, that they send his personal apologies to John Adams for mistreating him when John Adams was vice president. D, that they keep him on ice and unburied for 3 days.
I'm going to go with C because it sounds logical, but nothing about this is going to be logical, I can tell already.
No, he never wanted to apologize to John Adams. He felt John Adams deserved everything he got because George Washington was kind of a jerk. I'm sorry, I know he's the founding father of our country, but really, he was a jerk. If not for the slavery thing, he definitely did not treat John Adams well. One time, Hamilton bet Henry Lee that he couldn't slap Washington on the back. He promised him dinner if he did. So Henry Lee walked up next to Washington, put his hand on his back and said, "How are you, General? You doing well?" And George Washington stared him down until he stopped.
And the key thing there with Washington, the thing I remember most about early descriptions of him physically for that era as well, he was a tall. So staring down was the correct way to describe that, correct, for almost every man?
Yes, pretty much. Well, that was what John Adams, he wrote a list one time, I think while he was president, listing out George Washington's good qualities, which was he's handsome enough, rich, doesn't knows when to stop talking. And that was about it.
No love lost.
No love lost. But Washington was deathly afraid of being buried alive. This was a pretty common fear up to the 1900s. There were at times special plots devised with a bell, so it could be rung should anyone wake up from a longer than normal nap 6 feet below, which is wild to think about. But that was also the time where we turned up bodies to see if they were vampires.
So,
Yeah. So Washington then asked if Tobias Lear understood his wishes. Tobias, according to his records, choked, but not as much as Washington probably, with emotion and could only nod. Washington then asked, "Do you understand me?" Tobias then said, "Yes," and Washington's last recorded words were, "'Tis well." After returning to bed, Washington's feet were blistered by his medical team, and then he died.
that is a casual throwaway sentence in the narrative is just something in and of itself, right?
Yeah, I figured there's so much medical malpractice going on, I might as well just say, why would you blister a man's feet before he died? What are you hoping to? At that point, I think someone just had a very specific list of things like, what have I always wanted to do? Blister a man's feet. I studied this in medical college, but I've never done it.
I guess it's a dang good thing Adams wasn't there. Who knows what Adams may have wanted to have done? So there you go. It could have been worse.
Adams would just hold a meeting and have Washington sit there and not allow him to comment on anything. Just like, how does it feel, George? So, winds from the east fling Dr. William Thornton at last into our tale. Aged 40 years old and considered dashing for the time, he was the son of sugar plantation barons and extraordinarily wealthy, though forced to apprentice as an apothecary to keep him somewhat in line with his family's publicly professed Quaker values. Usually Quakers don't own slaves, but I guess that didn't bother the parents so much, as long as their son got a job. But Thornton was, through the profits of slavery, able to pursue multiple interests ranging from geology to medicine to steamboat design, and most notably, architecture. So, what building in Washington, D.C. did William Thornton design? A, the Capitol building. B, the White House. C, the Library of Congress. D, the Hall of Justice.
This is not the DC Universe Hall of Justice, I presume.
Ah, I'm glad you picked up on that joke. I was very pleased. I guess I should have said the Hall of Justice.
Yeah. And that that just heightens me back to my being a kid in the early 70s and Saturday morning TV Super Friends. But there are some folks in our audience who will get that reference, others will not. But that was my first exposure to that.
As long as we get the reference, what does it matter?
Yeah, I have no clue. Probably should know something like this because this is probably something I heard in touring any or all of those locales in DC. But I'm going to go White House.
Actually, he designed the U.S. Capitol building.
Hmm.
Yeah, he won a design competition that was held for it and won $500. He was actually listed as the first architect of DC.
Oh wow! So they didn't have a reality show called Project Capital or something like that. You actually had to have connections to make that work.
Yeah, it's also just a wild time when the US government could ask citizens of any ideas? I would love it if someone turned in a Hieronymus Bosch painting and it's so this is what I want the US Capitol building to look like.
I actually did not to chase a rabbit too far, but when you mentioned that, we're talking just about architecture in general. I watched one of the YouTube channels that I watch frequently this past week. It's called Top Tens, by the way, for those that are familiar with it. And it was the top 10 worst architecture things, buildings, designs ever. And let's just say there's some wacky stuff out there. I will leave it at that.
Oh, I love top 10s. I'll have to check that one out. I did consult a top 10s facts you didn't know about Washington while I was finishing up this story.
Without giving too many of our behind the scenes secrets away, Simon Whistler, who is the host of that, and it seems like every other YouTube channel that pops up constantly on my feed, thank you algorithm, is has been the inspiration of a number of thoughts that have eventually led to episodes here. So one of the ways that you can channel potential the future for A Fork in Time or The Room Where It Happened is get you a little Simon Whistler on the YouTube there.
Oh, yeah. Now, why exactly an architect was called in to treat the former president, you may ask? Well, Thornton, in his brief medical career, was renowned for his mastery of the cutting edge European treatment, the tracheotomy.
Hmm.
Yeah. Oh, it's at this point, Don, I should mention my father is a respiratory therapist. And so for his birthday, on which just passed this October 25th, I dedicate this episode to you, Dad. You hate horror stories. So I thought this would be an appropriate testament to you.
There you go.
So, a tracheotomy is a procedure in which an incision is made in the front of the neck and a breathing tube is placed into the trachea, or what's commonly known as a windpipe. This allows air to go into the lungs in case there is damage or blocking to the throat. Perhaps a necessity if you plan to blister the throat of a patient or stuff molasses butter and vinegar down it as well. Needless to say, Thornton was bummed out to find that his patient had already died before he got there, especially because he considered, like many people in this time, George Washington to be a kind of father figure. The amount of historical men who all think of George Washington as their father figure is large and very weird. Hamilton, Lafayette, William Thornton, maybe John Adams. I don't know. Maybe that's why they had such a testy relationship. But he had a plan to bring about the revival of George Washington. Now, in our timeline, he was stopped by Martha, who felt that, George Washington has gone through enough. But at this episode, we already said we're throwing everything out the window. So, here is how to bring about George Washington in a few easy steps for the folks at home. 1. Thaw George's body with cold water. 2. Cover the body with blankets. 3. Massage the body while removing the blankets in phases to spur blood flow throughout the body. 4. Perform a tracheotomy. Again, small incision to Washington's throat. Insert a pipe to allow air to go directly into the lungs. Step 5, artificially inflate Washington's lungs. 6, perform a blood transfusion using lamb's blood to replenish Washington's body. Step 7, profit. This was his plan. Basically, how you would prepare steak at home if you had it frozen is how he wanted to bring back George Washington to life.
And so lamb's blood playing a prominent role here in the episode more than I would have imagined was going to be the substitute for the deceased human's blood.
Yeah. Now, people might be wondering why lamb's blood? Well, the tradition of lamb's blood being used for transfusion experiments was started in France by the doctor Jean-Baptiste Denis. So on June 15th of 1667, Denis had conducted the first recorded xenotransfusion on a 15-year-old boy and a butcher who had both been overtly bled. Somehow they both survived this process, although the butcher then killed the lamb that saved his life and ate it. So grateful.
So essentially what I understand that Washington died from was some type of malady of the throat, which was dealing with the blockage of perhaps. So ironically, the tracheotomy, if had been performed while he was alive, may have provided some relief.
Yeah. Apparently, the weather stopped him from being able to get there in time. And then the added malpractice of all the other doctors couldn't put Washington together again.
Yeah.
In nursery rhyme terms.
Wow.
So, this comes to our next pop quiz question. Why not lamb's blood? Why wouldn't they use it? So again, I'm going to read off 4 answers to you, and you are going to find the reason why you wouldn't.
This is why you would not. This is the not.
Yeah, this is something they didn't list as a reason for using lamb's blood.
Okay.
A, and this is all from Dr. Jean-Baptiste Denis. So put yourself in the mind of a doctor from France in the 1600s.
Hold on. That's going to take a little channeling here. You channeled Washington's future Katharine Hepburn. I've got to take a moment just to be able to channel that. Okay, I'm there now.
All right. Thank you, Jean-Baptiste. I'm glad you could be here. A, because the Bible calls Jesus the Lamb of God, ergo lambs are the holiest animal. B, lambs don't drink, smoke, or swear like other creatures, including sinful man. C, because human blood would throw off the four humors of the body, or in this case, more human blood would throw off the four humors. Or D, because Pope Innocent VIII drank the blood of 3 boys and died anyway.
Wow. It seems like the last one should be the one that's eliminated, but history is what it is. I'm going to assume without knowing anything else that probably did happen. So I'm actually going to go with, I think, C there.
Correct.
You don't want to add human blood. That's already been the problem, right?
That's correct, Don. Well done.
And by the way, on B, lambs don't do that, nor do they date any other animals that do it either, kind of thing.
Yeah, I know, but it was so weird that was one of the reasons he said, like, well, sheep don't drink, sheep don't smoke, sheep don't sin.
Well, and by the way, that was not my answer, but that was obviously my channeled Jean-Baptiste answer, so that's why I was able to get that correct.
Of course. A fun fact, later on, Denis was implicated in the death of a man who he administered lamb's blood to, but that's another story. So this brings us to the afterlife of George Washington. Washington comes back to life, but he's unable to speak due to his tracheotomy. There is some speculation that he was dead too long to regain full control of his faculties. Nonetheless, it was a miracle. It was decided that Washington would remain in charge of Mount Vernon. He could still walk and eat, but was even more silent and probably slowly succumbing to necrosis because, again, his body had been dead for a while, no matter how well Virginia Snow could hold him up. So let's talk about the immediate repercussions. To take control of the positive publicity, John Adams ordered the creation of a new office to attend to the needs of the revived president. It was administered by William Thornton at Mount Vernon. It is still not enough for Adams to win the presidential election of 1800, and Jefferson becomes president. We're going to see a rise in Masonic lodges across the country as more people are thinking, oh man, are the Freemasons able to live past death?
They got resurrection going for them. I got to check that out.
Yeah. So do anti-Mason groups for the same exact reason of like, that's horrifying. What sort of necromancers are these Masons? We're going to see a lot of condemnation from basically every country across the world for this being pretty sacrilegious. And yet the price of sheep skyrockets across the globe. Isn't that interesting? Soon, the world's most expensive animal in this order are sheep, horses, and then cattle. Sheep's blood becomes a miracle cure that's carried in all major doctors' offices. And then George III, the other George of the era, dies in a botched transfusion in 1804, attempting to stave off another bout of mental illness. So George IV then becomes King of England much earlier.
So there's our fork repercussions. It isn't just limited to Mount Vernon.
Nope, not just Mount Vernon. And of course, people are wondering, well, what else can we use lamb's blood for? Several plantation owners do experiment in bringing back slaves since they figure, hey, that's going to be more effective to be worked into disintegration. But they're soon killed by other slaves, so that way they're allowed some freedom, even if it is in death. And we see a greater flow of immigration into the US in this time period, where a lot of people who are, say, French revolutionaries who had kind of bought into the more radical ideas come to the US because they're like, this is the place to be. The Enlightenment is in full swing. Not really. It was just the one guy. The Second Great Awakening, of course, is going to happen, which brings about a Washington cult. So the Willerites, under the leadership of William Miller, believed George Washington's revival was key and would lead to another great disappointment in 1843. But of course, I know, and you know, the real horror is property rights. So how does property get dispersed in a world where you can bring back dead presidents? Because guess what, Don? It's not just Washington. Almost every president is going to be brought back after death using the same treatment. And they're all going to be at Mount Vernon for the viewing public, except John Adams.
So in this weird, wacky fork of a time world that we've created, you don't have to wait until the 20th century to go to Disney for your Hall of Presidents. It's at Mount Vernon, and it's not just awkward animatronics. It's something far scarier.
Yep. And it's a really good thing that William Thornton was also an architect, because he soon starts applying plaster to the presidents in order to fill them. If you've ever seen a Cyberman from 1970s Doctor Who, where it's just the mask and then you can kind of see their mouth moving behind it, or Box from Logan's Run, that's pretty much what we're looking at here. Wow. So let's take a moment to just appreciate that image.
That's we said all rules were off here, and we were having no boundaries. But the most, ironically, Eric, the most interesting thing here is the concept that we would gather all of the revived presidents in one place. That's actually what I'm having the most. It makes sense, but that's what I'm actually having the most difficulty, and yet at the same time fun getting my head around, is this idea of the what are you doing? Well, we're going to Washington. Well, of course you're going to pop down to Mount Vernon and see you some half plastered resurrected presidents, because everybody's doing that.
Oh yeah, that is probably like a big tourism boom. Washington DC becomes an even bigger tourism town.
Yeah, like I said, it's Disney way before Disney, just in a bizarre, weird, Halloween-y kind of way.
Yeah, well, there's something that gets even worse, and this becomes one of the big debates of the time. So because they're brought back to life, do they still own property? This becomes a big thing with Una Judge, who I mentioned earlier. She was an escaped slave of Washington's, who he still was trying to get her to come back to the plantation. She married a free man of color who was a sailor, and they had moved to Connecticut, where Washington couldn't get them. And he would write her letters saying, Martha's very upset that you would leave her. And she's like, well, I'm free now, and I got 2 kids who would technically be enslaved. Also, her father was a white indentured servant. So these whole rules that we have about who is a slave and who is not a slave seem very irrational for a supposedly rational republic. And this would just be a back and forth.
So what I gather from what you said, Eric, in this proposed hypothetical, man, I got so many things running through my head. Westworld / there's all kinds of stuff just happening here in my head.
Is it Westworld or Washworld?
Well, ooh, we may have just landed on our title there, but for this episode. But in your scenario here, and again, this is all whimsy and throw to the wind, which is what I like about it. How long do these reanimated figures, that now this question is around, you mentioned that can't talk, but obviously are still alive, still have the ability to eat. And is it eternal as far as we know at this
Basically,
point?
as long as there is a fresh supply of lamb's blood to give them regular transfusions. That's kind of the most logic I put on it, of like, well,
yeah, hence the value of lamb's blood, hence massive breeding programs, hence lamb's blood futures, all the things that go with, to borrow a science fiction reference, I know enough of our listeners with this. It's not that the spice must flow, the lamb's blood must flow.
Yeah. Or, and in other words, like in trading places, it's not orange juice futures, it's lamb's blood futures, babe.
And again, we may have hit upon the other candidate here for the title of the episode. But by this point, our listeners will know, but they're still open to go here. So
Yeah.
the question you've raised is what happens with property rights, and that's an interesting thing because it's, well, if you remember the original, I guess the original draft of it was life, liberty, property, right? Not life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, because the assumption was that when you no longer had life, it wasn't your property to control anymore. But now we've blurred that line just a little bit.
Yeah. The culture that might have best answered this for the time was the ancient Inca from Peru, because whenever an emperor died, they would be freeze dried as a mummy, and then they would still own their property. It would be administered by one of their descendants, but basically, they still had to fulfill social functions to
Yeah.
where it's often recorded a mummy would go to tea with another mummy, talk, have drinks, take a bathroom break together, and then promise to meet up sometime, all of which is being done by their attendants, which is the weirdest ventriloquist act I've ever heard of. So maybe they get the inspiration of, well, that ended up creating a system to where there was essentially no property because everything was owned by 5 mummies. So maybe we should overturn that, which is what happens in Custis v. The US, because Washington's other descendants, and by descendants, these are the descendants of his stepchildren, since Washington was unable to have kids from an earlier disease. All of them are saying, like, hey, the US government essentially took our family home. Can we get some sort of payment in kind? And it's at that point decided if you are revived, it just goes straight to your descendants. There's not much to say. At that point, you become, I think Nietzsche said, an automaton of duty. You are now
Wow.
belong to the state.
Yeah. It's you know, getting a little serious here for a minute. I don't want to get too serious because the whimsy of this is what I'm enjoying about this little exercise that Eric's leading me down, and thus leading you as listeners down, I hope as well. Hope you've been playing along at home and keeping score for your own quiz scores, while I have been as well. Is you know property and how property works has long been the question of civilization, right? I mean, one of the reasons that geometry, as I understand it, and trigonometry and other types of things get developed in post floods like the Nile, or for the in the Fertile Crescent, is after that flood happens. Now you got to figure out again who owns what and where is it. So you plant this thing and then you take some measurements off of that using a little geometry there. So you know who has the property, the state or the individual, goes about as far back as we know civilization goes. So why would it be any different in a reanimated Washington world?
Yeah. However, we also get a new calendar from
Ooh.
our good French refugees from the Committee of Public Safety. So basically, Jacobites come over because they're really into what we're doing. And they decide to create a new rational calendar, starting with Washington's revival, which we now call the Baptismata Regressus. That is Google Translate for Washington revived. All years now start from 1799.
So we lose AD and we get the abbreviation for that.
Yeah, but it's kind of treated as like, yes, but we're still using AD. This is more of a civic holiday structure as opposed to I was going to say secular or religious calendar structure. It gets weird. But basically, Grace and I are now born in the year 196 BR. Because December 15th, the day Washington was revived, becomes New Year's. We celebrate Washington Miss every February 22nd. And October 3rd, we celebrate Thanksgiving. This is adopted by Lincoln during the Civil War, which is based on Washington's first call for Thanksgiving in 1789.
Wow.
Yeah. But if you're wondering, Don, do the Confederates try to kidnap George Washington and install him as president or king of the Confederacy for life?
I'm going to go with a yes. I'm going to go with a yes.
They do, but at the Second Battle of Mount Vernon, they are still repulsed, and they can only get John Tyler, which nobody is really thrilled about.
Well, dead might as well be dead. What's the difference, right?
Yeah. Do you want to hear about some of the notable commissioners of the Revived Presidents Society?
Absolutely. It's got to be a list that's long and distinguished, right?
Oh, of course. I'm going to mostly stick to the ones the audience will know from the 20th century, or I guess, the second century BR, but we got William Thornton, first commissioner of the Federal Monument Care Commission, a real monument man, if you could say.
Ooh.
He was filled with tears to see George Washington outlive him. He was appointed by John Adams, and he served from 1799 until his death in 1828.
Should have invested in some lamb's blood futures. That's all I'm saying.
Well, he wasn't a president, Don. That's only reserved for the presidents now.
Ah.
Or at least we tried to keep it safe to the president. That William Randolph Hearst III looks pretty familiar. Smells weird, too. Self-professed German count and X-ray technician Georg Karl Tanzler is tasked with the maintenance and care of the revived presidents. He developed his own means of reviving those looked over presidents who were not cremated immediately following their deaths. Some presidents tried getting away with that, but we put a stop to it.
Yeah.
He was the first commissioner to be impeached and convicted for misusing his research on a former patient named Elena Milagro de Hoyos, whose body he stole from the graveyard. He was appointed by none other than Warren G. Harding, and he served from 1920 to 1941. He was replaced by his deputy commissioner. We are going to cover Edward Gein, I never know how to pronounce it. Tanzler's deputy commissioner. He's mostly remembered for opening the Mount Vernon gift shop, where people could buy homemade leather goods such as lampshades and belts. He was later stripped of his post by President Henry Wallace in 1942. Henry Wallace became president because FDR tried using lamb's blood while he was still alive to cure his polio. Did not work out, clearly. Henry Wallace did not bad. Not a bad president. Now, this one, of course, is an easy one. She's the first female one to hold it. She's also the first non-naturalized citizen to hold the post. Ayn Rand becomes the commissioner. Her nomination was somewhat contentious for those reasons I've mentioned, but it was ultimately pushed through by Vice President Nixon and Senator Joseph P. Kennedy Jr. It was a brief and disastrous term, mostly because she did not know anything about medicine or architecture. She just wrote the fountainhead, and people thought, well, she must know something. But she wanted to do a hands-off policy, which left the deteriorating presidents at a dangerous rate. So she was appointed by Eisenhower and served from 53 to 54. But currently, today, the current commissioner is former Senator Bill Bradley. And after what happened in January 6th, the presidents, for their safety, were removed and put into Fort Knox, where they can be seen. Every president has the recreation of their personal quarters. So that way you can come in, see George Washington stand by the fireplace. You can't touch him, but you can see him, just like the old days and how George would have wanted it. That is where they are. That is where they will stay. In our Fork in Time's Hall of Presidents.
This doesn't happen often, Eric. I'm speechless.
Thank you.
That was fun. It's interesting that I'm glad that you picked up. I'll just say this because you mentioned what the general topic would be, but we intentionally left it a surprise how it would unfold during the episode so that I could go along with the listener ride here. But I'm glad that you picked up on sort of what the religious overtones of something like this would be and how it would affect things. But that just like any good government or democracy, government would have its hand in this. You know, this would not just be left to the private sector. No, this is too important. We have to manage this, control this, regulate this. It's um, that part actually stimulates the thinker in me, as to why is that the case? Because that is always the case. It's as simple as that. Cool.
I had so much fun writing it. I had to stop myself, and it's like I need to put a hard border on this.
In a more practical sense, again, not to take us back to more of the hard side, because again, we're going to keep this whimsical, but it's hard to imagine anybody else of that era that the effort would have been made for. Keeping him alive had some symbolic value for the reasons that it did in that, would have had in that era in terms of, being the first president. You're still in the generation plus of the revolution, the young country and all of that. There's, I'm actually looking over here at my bookshelf. Eric can see that I'm doing this. I keep looking off to my left. Why is he doing that? Because I see my copy of The Indispensable Man over there on the book, which is often used to describe Washington. I think that's why in some ways he was still at this point indispensable. I mean, I'm thinking of the line also from Hamilton, John Adams. Adams was no Washington in a lot of ways. Massachusetts versus Virginia, taller versus short, just all the other reasons they were not the same guy, right?
Yeah.
But there was a reason why Washington was sort of that unique guy at a unique time in a unique place, and so letting him go would not have been easy.
Well, no, and the fact that so many people wanted Washington to basically become a different King George.
A different kind of king. Yeah, exactly. It's I don't think we appreciate that as moderns, maybe quite the way that it was. Not that I don't think of that era as being, in modernity, but I don't think we think of that the same way. That this idea you point out, come and see what a president is. Go to the White House or go to Mount Vernon, because this was, in fact, I remember reading things about the Constitution. What are we going to call this job? What are we going to call this office? When we think of president now, it's a very different era that goes with that title that existed back when that was what was chosen by the founding fathers. It didn't carry the quote unquote presidential air. What that means now, it just was not the same. There were presidents, but not of countries.
Right. Well, it's the fact that I've always kind of attributed to the idea of, like, in our country, since we're a country of immigrants, like, no one has a strong claim except, like, the indigenous folk here. We have no real united mythology, no real united even religion that we can all kind of say, like, yes, this is what we're basing our sense of, when I say nationalism, that 19th century idea of nationalism. We don't really have that, but we have the founding fathers and we have this idea of revolution. Even how much they might not have lived up to their own ideals is clear, but we still hold to this idea of, like, it's why we've kept the Constitution for so long when so many other countries just kind of swap through it once it becomes irrelevant or they feel like it's not adequate to hold it. We still hold on to this idea because we are a country of laws, because we don't really have anything else to kind of bind us together naturally.
Yeah, I think that's actually a very insightful, deeper point, Eric, which is that the other word that popped into my head while you were talking there was we're a nation of aspiration, even if it's not realized aspiration in a lot of ways. And but you're right, it becomes, in fact, the term that I've used before, I think I used it on an episode here in the last couple of episodes. There's this idea of an American, almost American, that is our American mythos, because we don't have the other, the other absolutely common shared, yes, generally a deist Christian basis to a degree, but even the nature of the groups that came to become America were the separatist disparate parts of that. So even that's not fully, while it's agreed, it's not fully agreed even while it's being agreed. And hence the amendment that you get that says Congress shall make no law establishing that. That's actually there in the Bill of Rights for the reason that it is. But I think you're right. I think it is an interesting idea, and you know, and again, mythic is the word that I would use. Washington becomes a mythic figure. And so this idea, if you could have some place to, where you could go see the reanimated, whatever that looks like, plaster-faced Washington, people would make that trek. And I'm not just talking in the early 19th century. People would be making that trek today now to Fort Knox.
Yeah. And I feel like that would become like almost a holy spot for American civic life, to where I'm sure we would get some president who said, I went to there and I heard Washington said to me, 'tis well. I had a vision of him.
Yeah.
Say that.
I can certainly believe that.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to hit on before we close it out, Eric?
Only that I was finally able to figure out a structure for this when I figured George Washington, our president now and in afterlife, has kind of kept the same job. He poses, he stands there, and people pay to come and see him.
There you go. The Washington on the one and the Washington at Fort Knox sort of serve the same purpose, right?
Yep.
Cool. Eric, I appreciate you doing this. I mentioned to Eric off podcast before we started recording, because we had some difficulty getting lined up with everybody this week and making this happen. He was persistent about this, and I think it is a great thing. We're going to release this episode. Those of you already know this because we did it, but this is the future for us. We're going to release this on October 31st because we think it fits for that as sort of a special release. So I appreciate what Eric brings to the podcast, because he does bring a different flair that we don't always have with the rest of our team, and that's a good thing. And I've said this before, and I'll say it again. Eric is by far the most structured of us. If he's going to be on a podcast, we're covering a topic. We're getting Eric's notes before we get there, and that's always a good thing. I didn't have that benefit this time because it was intentionally designed for me not to have it, so I missed them. I do want to mention, if you've enjoyed this or you have some other ideas about what this would be, we have a place for you to go and interact with us now that's beyond just sending us an email or giving us feedback at the website, which is always welcome. www.aforkandtimepodcast.com. But we also have our Discord servers. There's a link in the show notes, and also on the podcast site. And we don't have hundreds of people there yet, but we have dozens of people that are there that are exchanging ideas, and we have fun conversations around this. And we do really welcome. I've really enjoyed, since we've had that up and going now for about a month and a half, to have a place where the feedback comes from our listeners that's a little bit more in real time. And also, what's cool about that is I would see, and Alexis would see, like forms that were completed on the website or emails that were sent. Not everybody on the team would see those immediately until I forward them. When it happens there on the Discord server, it happens in real time, and everybody can jump in, listeners as well as the team. And I like that part as well. So if you haven't checked that out, check that out. We're starting to have some fun there. We went way down the Star Trek rabbit hole after set phase 2 to Zahn a while back. And we discovered we may not even be the nerdiest, geekiest, science fictiony people in our circle on the team. There may be even more out there as well. So good stuff there. Eric, thanks for doing this. I'm just going to also mention to our, because this also is a plug for some of our less whimsical things. We talked about the Constitution there. We are working on getting the next phases of our ongoing series with the team, but also with Bo Breslin on his living Constitution thing. So in this case, we talked about a living Washington. There is a living Constitution in reality to a degree, or the idea that Bo Breslin has there. So look forward to that. If you haven't checked out those on The Room Where It Happened or A Fork in Time, I really recommend those. Those are, I think, are good episodes and covered a lot of good things. We had like legitimate people on that beyond the team, which also made it fun. So Eric, I'm going to give you one more chance. You have anything to sign off before I sign off? And if you do, now's the time.
Only that if you see A Fork in Time, don't revive Washington. Just let him be.
So I like that. This is our take. Is sometimes when you see the fork in time, let it go. Just let it go.
Sometimes dead is better, to quote Pet Sematary. That was a terrible impression, but
yeah. And Eric and I will talk off podcast as to why Katharine Hepburn got channeled, but that's neither here nor there. All right. So on behalf of Eric Bond and myself, we just want to say thanks again to you, our listeners. check us out next time. It will be something different. That much we can guarantee for sure. So have a great day, guys.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.